you for joining today's webinar, When Communities Come Together, Supporting Public Schools. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, and I serve as the Senior Faith Advisor with Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with our friends at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, known as the BJC, Congregation Beth Adam, the Hindu American Foundation, and Pastors for Children. We are grateful for their advocacy and collaboration in this work of prioritizing and supporting public schools, because it is necessary and important for the benefit of our children. American public schools are a unifying factor among the diverse range of communities in our society. Private school voucher programs, however, undermine the nation's public schools by diverting desperately needed resources away from public school systems to fund the education of a few select students in private and often religious schools. While religious schools can serve a valuable role for many children, and parents certainly may choose such an education for their children, no taxpayer should be required to pay for another's religious education. As an African-American woman, a mother, alum of Petersburg Public Schools, and parent to a school-age child who attend public schools, and an interfaith leader, I wholeheartedly believe that it takes religious and secular people of moral conscience to speak up and take action to address the actual and potential threat that private religious school vouchers or private vouchers pose to public education. So that's why we've invited you to be a part of this critical conversation among a diverse group of religious leaders to discuss supporting public schools. At Americans United, we believe that true religious freedom is a shield to protect us all, and it should never be used as a weapon to cause harm to others. Yet private voucher programs have been supported by religious groups that privatize education in ways that target and still disenfranchise many communities of color, religious minorities, and even children with special learning needs. Historically speaking, voucher programs were created in the 1950s and the 60s to defy desegregation orders after Brown versus Board of Education, because whites didn't want their children going to school with Black children. And yet in 2021, private school programs or private voucher programs continue to present a threat to racial and religious minority communities, as well as children with disabilities. In essence, private voucher programs are a very imperfect solution to a larger systemic issue in America. But today, I hope that you will take some time to listen to the stories and the experiences of our panelists, to listen for the many ways that you and your religious communities can take action, not just by opposing private voucher programs, but proactively supporting public schools and your local school districts. You can also start to imagine how you can partner with these organizations in doing this work. So on that note, I invite you to tell others on social media what is happening by using the hashtag #SupportPublicSchools. Feel free to use our Twitter handle @AmericansUnited. Also, we also encourage you to place your questions for the panelists in the Q&A. With that, I would like to introduce my colleague, Elise Hegelson Aguilar, to tell you more. But first, I'm going to tell you about Elise. So Elise Aguilar is the Federal Policy Counsel at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, where she helps manage AU's role as the co-chair of the National Coalition of Public Education. Prior to coming to AU, Elise worked on voting rights and electoral reform as a legal fellow with Fair Vote. She also previously worked on successful congressional campaigns, both in Florida and in Virginia. Elise is a graduate of the College of William and Mary and the University of Florida College of Law. With that, I would like to introduce to you my colleague, Elise Hegelson Aguilar.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Federal Policy Counsel here at AU, and I'm also, AU is one of the co-chairs, as Sabrina mentioned, of the National Coalition for Public Education, NCPE. NCPE is a coalition of more than 50 national organizations that support public schools and oppose private school vouchers, from education groups to civil rights groups to religious groups like many of the ones represented here. We all believe that public money should fund public schools. I'm so excited to have our panelists here today to share their perspectives on why supporting public education is important to them. Before we move on to the panel, I first just want to provide a little bit of background about vouchers generally, some of the resources you can use to oppose private school vouchers, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So let's start from the beginning. What are vouchers? Sometimes known as scholarships, or more broadly, sometimes framed as school choice. Vouchers are a means by which the government provides funds to students to pay for tuition at private schools. There are various types of voucher programs, such as tuition tax credit or tax credit vouchers, and education savings accounts. But these other forms are simply workarounds to the more straightforward voucher programs. In the end, the government forgoes funding that could otherwise support our system of public education that serves the vast majority of students in order to pay for a few select students to attend private schools. As a result, private school vouchers weaken our public schools. And because the majority of private schools are religious, voucher programs force taxpayers to support religious education. There are also a myriad of other reasons to oppose vouchers. Voucher programs are unaccountable to taxpayers. They fund discrimination. They can increase rates of segregation. They've been shown to weaken student achievement, and they fail to provide critical resources to the students most in need. Now more than ever, we should be investing in our public schools that welcome all children and unite communities, not in private school voucher programs that further divide us. Despite all of former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's attempts in the last 4 years to create a national voucher program, she was largely unsuccessful. However, there is one federally funded voucher program, which is the DC voucher program. And in 28 states, there is at least one type of private school voucher program. What's more is that legislators across the country continue to push for new or expanded private school voucher programs. Knowing that there would be a huge push for vouchers in state legislatures this year, NCPE created a toolkit to help legislators and policy advocates fight back against these voucher bills. Inside this toolkit, there's information about the recent Supreme Court decision in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue, a decision which undermined state constitutional provisions that had previously prevented some states from enacting voucher programs. There are also talking points on opposing vouchers, talking points specifically on opposing pandemic relief funding for vouchers, the most common types of legislative pitfalls explained in a document, as well as a list of voucher referendum that really demonstrate how unpopular voucher programs are among voters. I'm going to quickly share my screen with you all so that you can see how to access this toolkit on the NCPE website, as well as we will place a link to it in the chat box. As you can see here, we have a NCPE webpage that has a separate page where you can find this toolkit that I mentioned. You can see here that you can easily download the toolkit. You can request hard copies of the toolkit if you have state partners or allies or any connection to folks in the states who are fighting against voucher programs that would find it useful. You can also find more information about the webinars that we're putting on in conjunction with rolling out this toolkit, as well as many other resources here. And one of the great things about us rolling out this toolkit is that it's an opportunity for us to bring together other NCPE members and allies to put on a series of webinars like the one today that can reach different communities and highlight the importance of supporting public education from different perspectives. What our conversation today will focus on is refuting a misconception about private school voucher programs, which is that they are universally supported by religious groups. As you will see from our panel, that is simply not the case. And so with that, let me turn to the panel and introduce each of our panelists here today. First, we have the Reverend Jennifer Hawks from the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Jennifer is Associate General Counsel at IJC. She provides legal analysis on church-state issues that arise before Congress, the courts, and administrative agencies. A graduate of Mississippi College and the University of Mississippi School of Law, Jennifer earned her Master of Divinity degree from the George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. She is a member of the United States Supreme Court, Texas, and Mississippi bars. Next, we have Suhak Shukla from the Hindu American Foundation. Suhak is Executive Director and co-founder of HAF. She holds a BA in religion and a JD from the University of Florida. Suhak has helped steer the foundation to being recognized as a leading voice for civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. Suhak is also actively involved with many civic organizations, including serving as a member of the board for the National Museum of American Religion and serving on religious advisory committees for the Council on Foreign Relations, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Department of Homeland Security's Subcommittee for the Prevention of Targeted Violence Against Faith-Based Communities. She is also a member of the First Amendment Center's Committee on Religious Liberty and the United Nations Women's Gender Equality and Religion Platform. Next, we have Reverend Charles Foster Johnson from Pastors for Children. Pastor Johnson is the founder and executive director of Pastors for Children, an ecumenical organization mobilizing the faith community for public education support and advocacy. Pastors for Children now has affiliates in 8 states. He also serves as co-pastor of Bread, a faith community in Fort Worth. He was inducted into Morehouse College's Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers in 2008 and named National Outstanding Friend of Public Education by the Horace Mann League in 2020. And finally, we have Rabbi Robert Barr of Congregation Beth Adam. Rabbi Barr is the founding rabbi of Congregation Beth Adam and Our Jewish Community, an online congregation. Rabbi Barr is a popular speaker on a wide range of topics, including contemporary Jewish thought, religious fundamentalism, and ethics. Recognized by his peer as a leader in the evolution of modern liberal Judaism, his writings have been published in journals, books, and websites around the world. Rabbi Barr is active in the leadership of many Jewish organizations and has twice served as president of the Greater Cincinnati Board of Rabbis. He was ordained and awarded a Doctor of Divinity from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. In 2017, Rabbi Barr made history as only the 3rd rabbi in our nation to ever run for the US Congress. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we move into questions for the panelists, I just want to remind everyone in the audience today that if you have questions, we will be doing a Q&A session at the end. And so please put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can get to those later in the program. Okay, so I'd like to start first with a question for Pastor Johnson. Pastor Johnson, can you tell us how your faith informs your view on this issue? Why is it so important to you to support our public schools?
Thank you, Elise, and thank you, Reverend Sabrina, and thank you, Americans United, and the great witness that you have for church-state separation throughout the country. Well, faith is always voluntary. It is always a matter of the heart. It is always an individual decision. It needs no external coercion. It certainly needs no coercion or support or advancement or establishment by any government entity. It is integral to our faith that it be free, that it be voluntary, that it be according to the dictates of one's own conscience. Certainly not hampered by a governmental authority, and not advanced or established by that authority. As a Baptist, I believe that. As a Christian, I believe that. I'm so honored to be with these stalwart representatives of other faith traditions, the Muslim and Jewish tradition today. And I certainly know that leaders in those traditions believe the same thing. We're unified in that faith is always a matter of the heart. It is an individual decision. It is what theologians call free will. And we have, as human beings, the right and the responsibility for our faith. We can either embrace faith or we can reject faith, and that freedom should be preserved by law. So,
thank you.
So let me continue. I don't want to take up anybody else's time. So in our tradition, in the Baptist tradition, in the Christian tradition in general, faith is a family decision. It is in my tradition, it is an individual responsibility. We believe in something called the priesthood of all believers, which means that we do not even have to go through another individual outside ourselves for access to God. We have direct access with God. We also believe in a doctrine called soul competency. I'm using some technical theological language here that I imagine most of our listeners understand, that the soul is free. It is competent to make a faith decision. It needs no authority outside ourselves, that we have that access to God, or accordingly, that we have the right to not have a faith, to not follow a faith tradition. So there's a verse that St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians: for freedom, Christ has set us free. And that is the summation of what I believe as a Christian, that freedom, which was established in creation and confirmed by Christ and the apostles and the New Testament tradition, must be preserved to this day. And always liberation, always freedom, never coercion, never manipulation. And so any statute or any rule or any authority or any ruler that wants to use the force of government to promote his or her faith, that's wrong. And all of us must join together to stand down against it.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Barr, I'm going to shift into a question for you. Private school voucher programs divert funding to private schools, the vast majority of which are religious. Can you talk to us about how voucher programs undermine religious freedom?
Absolutely. But first, I want to thank you for inviting me, and delighted to be with all of you today talking about this essential issue. And at its core, before we speak specifically about vouchers, is the notion of separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is a principle that is so essential to what makes America America. As a religious minority, I recognize that America was the first place in modernity that allowed Jews to have full and equal access to being a full and equal citizen. Our nation was founded by we the people, who was conceived of as a secular nation. So this wall of separation of church and state is important. It has allowed not only Jewish minorities, but minorities of all religious flavors and beliefs, and those who are non-believers, to be full and equal citizens. And anything that erodes that wall or tries to nick at that wall is a danger to our nation, to its fundamental principles of allowing each person to have his or her individual beliefs and ideas. So how does vouchers undermine this? It's critical. It's asking each of us to pay for somebody else's religious education. I do not want to pay, nor do I believe anyone should have to pay for somebody's religious education, particularly when what they may be educated in is a belief system either in that has values that one doesn't hold. I mean, that is the problem. We're asked to pay for somebody's religious traditions and their education. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm a rabbi. I teach religious school every week. I've been doing, I thought when there was the old joke is finally when I was ordained, I thought, did I never have to go to religious school again? Being a rabbi means I've been going to religious school my entire life. I want to teach kids about religion, but that should be a family choice, and a family should pay for it themselves or maybe their community. But nobody should be forced to pay for somebody else's religious education. And that is what vouchers are asking us to do. It's compelling us to do something, not because we believe it's the right thing to do, but it's being made through law. So vouchers, by their very nature, undermine the notion of separation of church and state. And it is incredibly unhealthy. It's part of this camel's nose, if you will, underneath the tent. It's pushing its way in to say this division, this wall that we have shouldn't be here. I don't want anyone to be compelled to support a religious belief that they don't hold. I don't want anyone to be compelled to support my religious beliefs. That's not my right to ask you to pay for what I'm doing. And that is what is so unhealthy about it. And so together we need to stand up and say, enough is enough. People can make this choice, and they make the choice with their own actions and their own monies, but we shouldn't compel people to do that. That's why I'm opposed to this. And it is a position held by the majority of the Jewish community. There are some on the extreme right, if you will, the more orthodox community that would support vouchers, but the majority of the Jewish community has issued statements over the years standing in opposition to them.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, I want to ask you a slightly different question. Rabbi Bar talked about how vouchers undermine religious freedom for taxpayers. Can you go into a little bit more detail about the danger vouchers pose for religious schools and religious institutions that accept them?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Elise. And I too am honored to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues to address the important topic of why faith communities support public education. For me, as a Christian and as an ordained minister, my starting place is the Bible. In Matthew 6:24, Jesus taught us that no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. When private religious schools take government vouchers, they are trying to defy this teacher, saying, yes, we can serve God and the government at the same time. Vouchers threaten the freedom of religious institutions by making these religious schools accountable to the government, not their religious communities. As a taxpayer, I want to know how our tax dollars are being spent, and I support common sense accountability to know that we are getting what we paid for. And I know I'm not the only voter who feels that way. If a voucher is paying for education, then common sense accountability measures would involve admission, curriculum, testing, among other things. States generally give private schools wide discretion in these categories. Religious schools often have religion as a factor in admission, which could include anything from signing a statement of faith, required church membership and attendance, or even a reference letter from a pastor. Applying these admission criteria to students whose tuition is being paid by tax dollars is essentially adding a religious test to participation in a government service. In this case, a free elementary or secondary education. We can't have a religious test for public office, and we shouldn't have one for receiving a public benefit. Private schools also vary widely in their choice of curriculum and the use of standardized testing. So if vouchers are paying for the tuition of some students, then it logically follows that taxpayers should have a greater say in what these in the subjects that these students are taught, the curriculum that is being used, and how that information is being tested. Now, I know there's a great debate in the education community about the role of testing, but if testing is how the government wants to hold our public schools accountable, then it only makes sense that those same standards of accountability would apply to any education that's being funded with tax dollars. Paying for elementary and secondary education is a benefit for the whole community, which is why public education is ultimately accountable to the public through local school boards, state and local politicians, and public pressure. To give private schools the benefit of public dollars without the measures of accountability will be untenable for the long term. What the government funds, we all know, it will eventually regulate. Once private schools are dependent on government dollars, it will be difficult to walk away from that funding because new accountability measures are being demanded. As BJC has said before, it's hard to raise a prophetic fist against the government when the other hand is waiting for a check. Now, I think taxpayer accountability is a good thing, but we also saw some moves in the last administration to explore options of how to cut funds to private schools for politically motivated reasons. And just as public schools are often used as a political football in state legislative sessions, vouchers may eventually be in that same position with strings attached to that money that are not for common sense accountability measures, but rather us settling political scores. One final thought is that there was a study a couple of years ago on the impact of vouchers on the budgets of churches who run private schools. The study did find that regular voucher payments were helpful for stabilizing the church's overall budget, but also found that other giving, the tithes and offerings from the members, significantly declined. These churches were forced to cut spending on their staff salaries, mission support, and church maintenance as a result. Congregants, it seemed, are motivated to take their charitable giving to other causes when the government starts footing the church's bills. So religious schools who take vouchers are trying to serve God in money. And Jesus taught us that that simply doesn't work. Whether it's common sense accountability measures, being subject to the political whims of your state government, or just reduce financial faithfulness of the congregation, religious schools will suffer when they line up for a place at the government trough.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Suhak, I have my next question for you, and I want to go back to something that Jennifer touched on briefly in her answer, which is that private schools, despite receiving public funding, when they're taking private school vouchers, that they often discriminate against students. They can pick and choose who they accept, and many of these religious schools condition mission on being of the same religion or abiding by certain religious principles. Can you tell us what it's like for a student or family who's not from a Christian faith tradition navigating the system of schools that are majority Christian private schools, and how much of a choice is it really for families when the majority of schools won't even accept their child?
Thanks for that important question. And thanks to Americans United for hosting this very important conversation. Thanks, Sabrina, and go Gators, Elise. I didn't realize we're both University of Florida alumni. So I want to first start with my own story. Between kindergarten and high school, my family moved 7 times. And my parents were not military, but while commute to work, walkability of neighborhoods, or updated kitchens and bathrooms were important factors in our house searches, the single driving factor for them was school district. And then once we moved to a good school district, the next consideration for the next move would have been, well, where's the best school, public school in this district? And this story very much reflects the story of so many other, probably the vast majority of Indian American and Hindu American immigrants. So I'm a product of America's public schools. My husband is a product of America's public schools, as are our 2 sons who are now in college. So this is an issue that is important to me, not just as an American, but also as a member of a religious minority. We've talked about the majority of private schools being religious, but I want to just give a little bit of scope on the numbers. So I got these statistics from the National Center for Education Statistics. There are 50.7 million students in public schools. There are about 5.6 million students in private schools. And these 5.6 million private schools, what do these private schools look like? When we say vast majority, we're talking about 76% of schools being religious, whether they're Catholic, conservative, Christian, mostly affiliated and unaffiliated. About 24% are non-sectarian. So obviously when religious, when adhering to a particular religion is a requirement for entry, it doesn't leave much choice for those children who are coming from religions that are not aligned with the particular theology of a school, or for families that maybe value the quality of education that's being provided at a local religious school, but also want to be able to retain the religious identity and practices that they want to pass on to their children. My esteemed colleagues here on this panel have talked largely about the philosophical, the constitutional, and institutional challenges around vouchers. And I want to drill down a little bit to student well-being, and particularly Hindu American students. We conducted a survey several years ago, and the majority of the students who were responding were from public schools. And what we found was that 1 out of 3 respondents said that they had been bullied for their religious beliefs. 1 in 2 Hindu American students who had responded indicated feeling awkward or social isolation as a result of their religious identity. So obviously, even these are challenges in the public school setting, but they just get amplified in a private school setting. So there's not really much of a choice. You have a community that is contributing to the taxpayer funds that are then being diverted to vouchers. So it's not just an issue of fairness and constitutionality, but also what is the impact going to be on children? Now, the ways that we've been addressing school billing also has kind of a bar to entry when we're talking about faith-based private schools. There's obviously an importance in teaching about religion and getting it right, and improving curriculum and pedagogy, and providing professional development to educators and administrators to push culturally proficient educational materials and curricula. Now, these programs and this type of outreach has been largely successful in the public school setting, but in the private school setting, there's a bar to entry, because not only are private schools not regulated by what the state might require in terms of what needs to be taught, but they might have their own vision or narrative around world religions. And so that also becomes a challenge with private schools. And so that's why it's important for our community to ensure that public schools are supported and are doing well.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, I'm going to go back to you with another question that really, I think it moves off of what Suhak was talking about in terms of our public schools really serving all students and how private schools are not equipped to do that. One of the things that we see often with private school voucher programs are that they are purportedly meant to help certain populations, whether that's low income students or students with disabilities. In Florida, there's a voucher program specifically for kids who've been bullied. But what we actually see is that so many times, even with these targeted programs or these populations, these voucher programs are meant to serve, that these programs actually really don't serve these students that are in the programs. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how voucher programs really don't help the kids they're intended to?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great topic to explore. As you mentioned, we often do see voucher programs proposed as a way to reduce inequalities, whether it's low-income students with physical or mental disabilities, or other specific communities. One of the issues is that vouchers are almost never enough to cover the full cost of tuition. So low-income families, even if it's a voucher specifically for their community, they have to have enough disposable income to make up the difference for tuition, as well as pay the additional expenses like transportation or specific uniforms or books and supplies. These private schools typically aren't required to provide a free or reduced breakfast or lunch program. So students who qualify for a voucher, again, because of their economic situation, are potentially missing 2 meals a day that they would get in a public school. For students with disabilities, the problems are even more magnified. Most private schools are not willing or able to serve students with moderate to severe disabilities. And even if these schools are willing to accept students with special learning needs, it is typically only students who are highly functional and need few, if any, special accommodations for their disability. Private schools which use a child's disciplinary history as a factor in admission also disproportionately exclude students with disabilities, as it's not uncommon for a child's physical or mental disability to manifest itself in such a way that might be disruptive to a classroom environment, thus resulting in increased school discipline as compared to their peers. Students with disabilities lose many, if not most, of their protections under federal law when they're enrolled in a private school, which is typically not well explained to the parents who are considering private school options, voucher or no voucher. A recent study of the DC voucher program, the only federally funded voucher, found that almost 22% of the parents who ultimately rejected a voucher did so because they could not find a school to serve their child's needs. 12% of parents who took a voucher ultimately left the program because of the inability of the private school to meet their child's special educational needs. So the child, even though he or she had received a voucher, ended up back in the public school system. And then just last year, a study of Mississippi's voucher program for students with disabilities found that the program lacked the accountability necessary to ensure that students with disabilities were adequately being served, and that 1/3 of the voucher funds were unspent because there was not a private school that would be willing to accept the students. We've also seen attempts to create vouchers for military connected kids. These attempts fail in part because of the federal protections that these kids would lose. Because military kids are often more transitory than non-military connected kids, special federal protections exist for these military connected students regarding education issues, such as enrollment and placement and being on track to graduate on time. None of those protections would extend to private schools. And when the money in these programs goes unspent, there are typically calls to expand the program by increasing income eligibility limits, which means that a program sold as a way to give educational opportunities for low-income students eventually becomes a government subsidy for families who were already paying for private education. So rather than solving problems, this bait and switch only exacerbates the inequalities that we see in our society.
Thanks, Jennifer. And so, Pastor Johnson, despite all of these failings of voucher programs, we see proponents of private school vouchers continually frame the issue as one of parental choice, that parents should have this choice of where their students go to school, where their children go to school. What would you say to someone who says that every parent has the right to send their child to a school and receive a religious education?
Yeah, well, of course they do. There's nothing that prevents them from doing so, and I'm a pretty good exemplar of that, Elise. I realize I didn't answer the second part of your question about faith leaders and people of faith supporting public schools. The public school is the place where people come together from all backgrounds. It is the place where Hindu kids and Jewish kids and Christian kids and all the respective varieties of those traditions and many other faith traditions and no faith tradition at all come into the public school, and they learn conflict management and character training and development and how to get along, how to be neighbors one with another. Now, I'm a good exemplar of that sort of hybrid because I did half public and half private, and I see the benefits of both. And one of the strong messages that we have is keep the government out of our church schools, keep the government out of our synagogue schools, keep the government out of our mosque schools. We don't want the power and authority of state government fiddling around and meddling. The reasons that my co-panelists have already given are very, very cogent. The money never really covers the cost of an adequate education, okay? What it does is goes to the perpetuation and preservation of the religious institution often. And we have faith leaders in states, voucher states like Indiana and Florida, tell us that. I use state money and tax money to fix up my church, to fix up my congregational meeting place. Well, that's wrong. Look, you line up 10 different Baptists, you're going to get 11 different opinions. There are lots of Baptists I don't agree with. I don't want my tax dollars supporting that baloney. I don't believe in it. A lot of those doctrines and those teachings are not only sort of neutral to my particular faith, but they're opposite, they're oppositional, they're contrary to my convictions. A lot of oppression, a lot of discrimination, a lot of bias, a lot of prejudice. I don't want God's common good money perpetuating those doctrines. One of the examples I use is I'm a Baptist. I do not believe in the infallibility of the Pope or the veneration of Mary, not in the same way Roman Catholics do. And, you know, you can hear a pin drop when I'm speaking to a group about that. They think I'm trucking out an anti-Catholic bias. And then I sort of give a pause, any more than my Catholic friends believe in the priesthood of every believer, like Baptists do. They shouldn't expect to perpetuate and promote my doctrine any more than I should be expected to promote their doctrine. So let's keep public public, let's keep private private. And that way we learn how to be neighbors and we learn how to preserve the First Amendment tradition of church-state separation.
Thank
The
you.
public school is the place where that's done, Elise. That's the reason people of faith ought to support it. In a nutshell, maybe we can talk about that a little bit later.
Thank you so much. I want to shift gears a little bit to Rabbi Barr. You are a leader in your community and a leader of your congregation. And I know we have other faith leaders who are watching this webinar right now. So can you talk to us a little bit more about how you view your role as an advocate, in particular in support of our public schools?
Absolutely. The conversation that we're having and the role of public schools is really about what we want America to be. That's really the conversation. It's specific to this piece of our culture, of our nation, but it really is emblematic of what is our nation about. Public schools, as the minister just said, brings together people of diverse beliefs, non-belief, experiences, traditions, cultures, language. It is a place where we get to teach children about what it means to be part of this grand experiment, to learn about our government, how to wrestle with complicated problems, and how to be good citizens. We're witnessing a time in America where our divisions are growing, where that chasm keeps getting bigger. And it's our responsibility, I think all leaders and all people, to work to find a way to bridge the chasm, to help bring people together. And our children are essential to that because they're the next generation. They're going to inherit the good we have done, and certainly they're going to inherit those bad things that we have left them. So my responsibility, and I believe the responsibility of all responsible adults, whether we're clergy or not clergy, is to work to make our society healthier. We are either contributing to the problem or we are making it better. There are no bystanders in America. You can't sit on the sidelines because we're all part of this grand conversation. So for me, engage in this conversation. Why do I take time out of my rabbinic responsibilities and my congregational responsibilities to be engaged in conversations with Americans United and others concerned about separation of church and state and other questions? It's because we all thrive if we have a healthy nation, a society that is welcoming, that recognizes our diversity and respects that diversity. And that's why I'm engaged in this conversation. And it's important. It's important to build the bridges. It's important to wrestle with the challenges. And it's important also to show our children that it is possible. I worry a lot about what our kids are seeing, how they're watching adults shout at each other, unable to have a civil conversation. Are they going to simply mimic our behaviors and continue this erosion? Or can we, working together in a conversation like this about why public schools are so important and why we shouldn't divide our children, are we going to help them to understand that there is a way to knit the fabric of America together, to keep the fiber of our nation strong, to recognize that together we can create something that's remarkable? Our future isn't guaranteed. It rests in our hands. It rests in our decisions. So this conversation about vouchers, for me, while specific to that question about how it erodes separation of church and state, really says to me and asks me and asks each of us, what are we prepared to do to ensure that our nation is strong, that we are a diverse and welcoming community that respects and celebrates diversity, that is inclusive and is just and is equitable and is built on the principles of freedom and justice that people sacrifice their lives for? That's why it's important, I believe, for all of us to be invested in this conversation. And that's why I'm so delighted to be participating in this conversation with all of you today.
Thank you so much. And I have one final question, and that's for Suhak. This is sort of a big picture question. We see, as we talked about, that there are proponents in the state legislatures and across the country who are pushing to create new voucher programs or expand voucher programs. So what's at stake here? What's at stake if we don't push back against these voucher proposals? And what's at stake if we don't prioritize funding for public education?
Thanks for that question. Let me just say it's kind of hard to follow two reverends and a rabbi because they just have a way of evoking the importance of these issues, not in the dry manner that I'm likely about to embark on. But I want to kind of build on what Reverend Johnson and Rabbi Barr said in terms of the benefits of diversity. And I'm going to go back to statistics. First of all, public schools on the whole are more diverse than private schools are. Public schools are roughly, based on the statistics from that national education resource that I mentioned before, about 50% are non-Hispanic white, 25 to 26% are Hispanic, 15% African American, and the remainder between Asian, multiracial, American, Native American, and Alaskan and Pacific Islander. When we look at private schools, you have a little over 70% of students who are non-Hispanic white, less than 10% African American, roughly 10% Hispanic, and about 7% Asian. So why do I bring this up? Because public schools, as I said before, tend to be more diverse, and diversity is good for all the reasons that have been brought up by my co-panelists. But studies also show that diversity and exposure to diversity at an early age not only enhances cognition, it improves social skills, it encourages mutual respect, and it fosters critical thinking. All of these cognitive skills, these social skills, better prepare our children for our country's future citizens for an increasingly diverse, pluralistic, and unfortunately polarized democracy. It also better prepares them for global citizenship. Let's face it, we have no guarantee that our children will not be working in another country, perhaps, or they might be having colleagues who are from somewhere else. And being able to navigate differences is critical as the world becomes smaller. Now, all of this is important, but how is that connected to vouchers? Not only are certainly public schools are places where we've seen that the student bodies are more diverse, but public schools need adequate funding to deal with increasing diversity. Administrators and educators need to constantly find ways to build curricula and build programs that are going to help students of diverse backgrounds succeed academically, to get along with one another, and to learn about one another. And what vouchers do is they take away critical taxpayer dollars from these schools, and many of these schools are already facing underfunding. So essentially, the well-being of our children and their preparedness for increasingly diverse communities and a globalized world really depend on well-funded public schools. And that, to me, is at the crux of this issue.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and have really appreciated all of your really thoughtful and insightful comments. I just want to turn to the Q&A box now. We're going to take some questions. So if I could have all the panelists come back on the screen, turn on your cameras. We're going to go through some of the questions, and please feel free to step in when you want to answer one of them. So we've had a few about fighting back against voucher programs. We've had one about, state legislatures and the political makeup of a lot of them across the states, in particular, and, in states where there are Republican-controlled legislatures or which are more inclined to support voucher programs. So the question is, how on earth can we stop these programs? And specifically, there was also a question, if someone, I may be looking at Jennifer, if you wanted to touch on Espinoza, there was one about state constitutions too, about those legislating for vouchers. How are they getting around state constitutional provisions?
Elise, if I may, before Jennifer answers the legal implications of Espinoza, she is an expert. Reverend Jennifer Hawks and Rabbi Barr and Suhak, don't ever underestimate your power as a layperson. It is the most powerful voice. You know, Rabbi Barr and I are paid hands, but when you come in, it has tremendous authority. So these faith leaders know when you come in the name of your faith and say, we affirm a government-sponsored, community-sponsored public trust, public institution. We affirm that. We don't want government help for our sectarian cause. We want that to be voluntary. The word that I used, it's a time-honored word in the Baptist tradition. We want that to be free, and we want public to be for all our children, regardless of their background. There's tremendous power in that as a faith leader, and we have seen that in Texas. We do not have a voucher policy in Texas. And sisters and brothers, let me assure you, it's not because it hadn't been tried. It's because it's been stopped by people of all faiths joining together. And that's a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, so Pastor Johnson is one of our most excellent advocates on faith-based support for public education, and has been a long-time advocate. And I would encourage you to visit his website because Pastors for Children has a lot of resources, and connect with him, and he can help with those causes as well. So with the constitutional question, I saw the constitutional provision put in the chat box, and that was not the constitutional provision at issue in Espinoza. The one in Espinoza was Montana, like most state constitutions, has a provision that the government will not give money to religious institutions. And so it was challenged that it would be inappropriate to have religious schools receiving money from the government, and would violate that constitutional provision. And the Supreme Court looked at it and found that it was a matter of equity, basically, that the free exercise clause requires religious schools to be included in a voucher program that a state may offer. It does not say that states are required to create voucher programs, and so that is one of our still primary avenues of attack. Just because something is permissible does not mean it's a good idea, and there's all kinds of policy reasons why vouchers simply don't work. But the provision that was mentioned is certainly something that is coming up. It's more of a common school provision, which a lot of state constitutions have. And it would be through that constitutional provision would be one way that the accountability measures that I spoke of earlier, that could potentially limit the freedom of some of these institutions, could essentially be added on to any voucher legislation, because if a state constitution requires a common fund that is providing a certain level of education, well, then at some point the state has to figure out how to measure what education is being provided, so that all students are receiving the common education. So those are very important constitutional provisions that we'll probably see in future litigation. The more recent litigation has been over separation of church and state constitutional provisions.
Great. And I think, part of that question too was about how can we stop these people that are watching these programs, particularly in states like Florida, where there's already 5 voucher programs and they're pushing for more. It can often feel really powerless. And I know Pastor Johnson, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear from others on, how do we empower people to stop these? What can we do?
I think we also need to recognize that we may lose some ground, and that's going to be disheartening. But people have been working to slip vouchers and erode the separation of church and state for many, many years, almost 40 years now. We've been watching this, and it's difficult. I think those of us who value separation of church and state, who oppose vouchers because of what it does to dismantle the importance of public school, we do have our work in front of us. And while we may get disheartened with some of those cases, and certainly the courts have become more conservative and judges have been placed on it that may make rulings that we don't like, that means we have to double down on the kind of work that we need to do. We need, and I think this is why Americans United is so important, we need to be well organized. We need to have litigation where possible, but we also need to do education as well. We need to help people in our country remember why our country is so special. Why the beginning, when it says we the people, it was a notion of a nation that had never existed on earth before. It was the governed creating the government. It was not by divine rule. So we have our work cut out for us to teach about the importance of what it means to be a secular nation and how that nation allowed those of religious beliefs to flourish because religions here had to compete. It made it different than when there were state-sponsored religion. And it also made those who may not have had a faith tradition also feel equally included. So I think we need to look at the future in multiple steps. Litigation where possible, education everywhere, and doubling down and working together and building bridges and finding commonality with folks to articulate our message and then work to make sure people hear it.
If I could also add to what Rabbi Barr was saying, we also need to be willing to contact our elected officials. A lot of times we get in our circles and we talk and we complain about what the government's doing or what the government's not doing, but we don't take the step of actually contacting our officials. And it's really easy for officials to ignore people who are not reaching out to them. And they can say, well, nobody contacted me to say that this is a bad program. And they can say that honestly, because none of us contacted them to tell them this is a bad idea. So, I think the more willing we are to engage with each other and with our community and absolutely building, good coalition groups and reaching out across theological divides, across political divides, across neighborhood divides. All of those are excellent foundations that we need to lay. But we also need to take that next step of reaching out to our state and local elected officials. We need to be willing to submit comments for the official record. We need to be willing to testify and to come forward and say, no, as a person of faith, as a person of non-faith, this is why I support public education, and this is why I want more to be done to keep our students safe and to keep them healthy and learning, rather than just sitting back in our echo chambers, which is a lot more comfortable to do.
I'll quickly just say that Americans United has been such a valuable resource. You just have to take a quick visit to the AU website to see, get some tools on what to do. This is an issue that's important to us at HAF, but not one that, we are singularly focused on. And so we really turn to the expertise of Americans United and appreciate the leadership that AU has demonstrated in this regard. And so that's the place to start, I think. Support Americans United and use the tools that are there for all of us to be able to just pick up a phone or draft an email and get it sent to the people who need to hear how important this issue is to us.
Suhak, I think you're exactly right. And to Rabbi Barr's point and Reverend Hawks's point, the policymakers need that education. Not just the community. We must educate the community. There's no question about it. And we are community leaders in Cincinnati and in Fort Worth and Washington. And we live in a neighborhood and we have a context, and every parent, every pastor, every imam, every rabbi, every PTA leader, every councilman, every school board member. But those policymakers, there's just a very small number of them. We have 181 in Texas. Those are 181 gatekeepers. Let's go take that AU and BJC material and build a relationship with that policymaker and say, Read this, and we're going to come back next week and talk to you about it. They're hearing from high-powered, rich forces all over the country, lobbyists making $100,000 a month, but that's not more powerful than a community leader, a mom, a dad, a PTA, a pastor, a priest, a rabbi.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to have to cut off our questions here because we've simply run out of time. But again, we really, really appreciate all of your insight. And I will turn it over to Sabrina now to close us out.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was certainly a robust conversation, and as you can see, we could continue this conversation for a few more hours if need be, but we don't have that time, unfortunately. But I would like to thank all of our panelists, Rabbi Robert Barr, Reverend Jennifer Hawks, Pastor Charles Johnson, Suhak Shukla, Elise Aguilar, as in the words of Rabbi Barr, he said, every adult has a responsibility to make the society better for our children, and that we all have a responsibility if we want to thrive and have a healthy nation. So it's important for us to build bridges and to show our children that it is possible. And so we all have a responsibility, as Reverend Hawks said, contact your elected officials, hold them accountable for the pieces of legislation that are coming forward. We have a responsibility to protect our public schools. American public schools provide the space for the type of communal work that is equitable, that is inclusive, and that is just. And so we have a responsibility to protect public schools. Around the country, we might recognize that many public school districts face many challenges in supporting the children. But imagine if these public school systems were more than adequately funded and supported by taxpayer funds, how our students could have what they need in order to thrive in society. So with that, I just want to say thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. I encourage you to stay connected with Americans United, as well as all of our partners that were featured on today's program. I also encourage you to download the NCPE Toolkit that gives you the resources and the tools that you need in order to be a part of this fight and actively engaged in it. And we ask that you continue to do this work by getting engaged with your own public school districts, walking alongside these organizations and others that are doing this work. Again, we all have a role to play in opposing vouchers by supporting public education, by supporting our children. And we hope that the information that we've provided you today will help you do your part. So thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.